Okay, thanks so much, Kyle. It is great to be here talking to all of you today. And the thought I really want to kick off with is the idea that transhumanism is everywhere. It's in best-selling books that are praised by world leaders and billionaire philanthropists. It's embedded in the aspiration to make humans a multiplanetary species. And it's implied by any project that is driving us towards the advent of artificial general intelligence or superintelligence. But the tricky part is that this is a philosophy, a social movement, and an evolutionary force that is really hard for us to wrap our heads around clearly. And a big part of the reason of that is because it's lots of different things at once, and it's infused in lots of different projects in different ways. Like capitalism in the West, or perhaps maybe even electricity, it's omnipresent, but it can feel almost invisible. Now, I've been thinking deeply about transhumanism for a good 10 years now. As Kyle said, I wrote a PhD on the subject, on the history of those ideas and the technologies and why they're so important in our world. And I've recently published a book called Future Superhuman, Our Transhuman Lives in a Make or Break Century. And what I'm going to cover in this talk is a general sense of what this philosophy and social movement is all about, but then interspersing that discussion with an argument that really what matters is not the ism per se. Not in the form of those who have rallied under the banner as card-carrying transhumanists working at Humanity Plus. It's the idea that we're living in a transhuman era. We're in transition between these squishy, meat sack existences where we still have relatively unenhanced bodies and minds, and we're moving towards something that feels like a more radically enhanced, even post-human future. Something that's so far away from humanity as we know it that we would need a new term to define it. And perhaps in its best incarnations, we might call that a superhuman future. We're also going to talk about how transhumanism is a way of thinking that actually permeates EA culture in far deeper ways than I think a lot of us might imagine. And we'll touch on why it's so good at flying under the radar, both in EA circles and globally. And we'll wrap up with some musings on the yuck factor, the cringe that transhumanism induces in so many people when we start to confront these really often scary visions of this idea that the world's going to change really fast in our lifetimes. And that decenters us as individuals, that makes us rethink our life scripts, that gives us a sense often of a rug pull, that we don't really know what's coming, and therefore we quite often want to cleave to what we know and go back to visions of the past. So jumping straight in, to give you a sense of what transhumanism is all about, I really think that a good way to think about it is that it's kind of like humanism on steroids. Or you could say it's what happens organically to humanism when you industrialise and invent really powerful technologies that are capable of expanding our visions, I suppose, of what we think is possible for our future. Now, when I say here that transhumanists think the best versions of humanity are post-human, I don't mean that they think that all versions of post-humanity are good. I don't imagine there's a single person in this room that would buy that argument, and I don't really know of any transhumanists who believe that either. The point is really that as a philosophy and a worldview, transhumanism is an outgrowth of Enlightenment humanism. And you can see that in the fact that transhumanists are on board with so many of the core elements of an Enlightenment project. They think reason and science are good. So is free inquiry. Education and public policy are important levers of social progress. Poverty is something that we want to reduce as much as possible, like any other form of human suffering. And of course, transhumanists are all for doubling down on promoting things like global literacy, reducing child mortality, and reducing the global disease burden. Like humanists, the focus is on being as well as possible. So what's actually different is that transhumanists pursue a bolder vision of well-being than most humanists. They aim to be better than well. Transhumanist visions of a good life include an array of possible futures that are not necessarily biological or even recognisably human. The key feature of transhumanist thinking that distinguishes it from humanism is the embrace of post-human evolution, a state so far beyond present-day humanity that we would need a new term to define it. You could also say that humanists place the human at the centre of their project, while transhumanists think of humanity more as a stepping stone on route to some new form of intelligent life that is more resilient, more capable, can expand beyond the planet, and that is better equipped to stave off the big existential threats that we face. And if that's sounding kind of familiar to you in terms of resonances with a long-termist vision, that's no accident, as we're about to see. It's also no accident that transhumanist types of ideas start to appear more prominently in the 20th century in the interwar and post-war periods in Europe. They start to ramp up in the era of 70s counterculture and 80s cyberculture in the United States, and they really coalesce into a formal philosophy with an encoded set of principles and a movement and a following in 1990 with Max More and extropianism. And extropy, by the way, is this kind of metaphorical antonym to entropy. It's the idea of staving off the heat death of the universe and the loss of all potential. So you can see here a basic outline of the first transhumanist principles. And the key idea is that extropians didn't think humans were or should be considered the endpoint of evolution. They were excited by the possibility of using science and technology to maximise our potential as individuals and as a species. So they were really excited by prospects of intelligence augmentation, life extension, and health span extension, all kinds of radical technologies that can really intervene in human potential in a more dramatic way, and morphological freedom, the freedom to choose to be more than what we are. The language and the style of transhumanist movements has evolved quite a bit over the decades, but the core concerns really remain consistent over time. It's always been about using science, technology, and rational thinking to open up new options for dramatically improving the lot of present and future beings. So, like I said, this might be sounding a bit familiar to those who are in EA and who've thought about long-termism. And that's no accident, because names associated with the extropian movement in the 1990s that you might know, including folks who wrote for Extropy magazine, who posted on the extropian mailing lists, and who attended conferences and events for this organisation, include folks like, where are we? Robin Hanson, Nick Bostrom, Eliezer Yudkowsky, Hans Moravec, Ray Kurzweil, Marvin Minsky, Eric Drexler, and Anders Sandberg. Nick Bostrom and David Pearce also went on to found the World Transhumanist Association in 1998, which was rebranded as Humanity Plus a decade later. And this is the threshold moment that really matters as far as the lineage of EA thinking is concerned. Because what we start to see when the WTA supplants extropian transhumanism as the dominant movement is all of a sudden this explicit focus on existential risks, and they get encoded in the formal transhumanist principles, using that word, and chiefly through the writing of Nick Bostrom, first in 1999, but in essence without the term being used as early as 1998. We also see a focus on operating effectively within democratic systems. So while the extropian transhumanists were quite laissez-faire, very libertarian, very anti-authoritarian, and kind of didn't want to play ball in that ballpark, the WTA guys recognised that to kind of get anything done in the world, you needed to actually operate within the existing systems. There was an explicit concern for the welfare of other sentient beings that also got encoded around 1998. And then there was this focus on distancing transhumanism a little bit more from the kooky and histrionic elements of the culture to make it a more academically respectable discipline. So much so that it might become the kind of thing that, you would research in, say, a faculty of philosophy. Maybe one that would one day go on to house a research institute that focused on things like existential risks, superintelligence, simulation hypotheses, and how our AI might transform our world and our species for the long term. The seed of places like FHI, MIRI, and CSER were in part actually sown in this moment and through this culture. So while organised transhumanist movements got quite a bit quieter from around 2005, even as they actually continued to grow globally, so more and more countries, as we got broadband internet and more people got connected, there were more organisations springing up. But in terms of that loud, proud banner and people being really brazen about all these ways they wanted to transform humanity, it kind of dampened a little bit. And the real reason is not that transhumanism went away. What really happened is that it actually slipped the net of formal transhumanist movements. It became such a pervasive way of thinking and often more expedient to just channel particular transhumanist ambitions into whatever academic or private sector projects that you were working on. And this is the kind of moment where we see it become deceptively invisible in our world. Yet we can see it if we know where to look, because it is discernible in the ideas and aspirations of so many prominent scientists, intellectuals, and influential tech leaders. So back in that heyday of techno-optimism, by which I mean 7 or 8 years ago, Mark Zuckerberg talked openly about his interest in curing all known diseases in his children's lifetime. He's spoken enthusiastically about his dream of telepathic communication. He's currently pushing for a metaverse, and he told Stephen Hawking that the scientific questions that he's most interested in are the ones that have to do with understanding, hacking, and reverse engineering human biology, so that we can be radically smarter and even understand what it takes to, in his words, live forever. Now, if that isn't a transhumanistic vision, I honestly don't know what is. And in that vein, of course, we have to mention Elon. His visions are no less overtly transhumanistic. Becoming an interplanetary species, connecting our brains to computers, building AGI, and merging with artificial intelligence. Over at DeepMind, we have Demis Hassabis, who has made no secret of the fact that he wants to build artificial general intelligence. The company's mission statement until very recently was solve intelligence, use it to make the world a better place. And about a week ago, when talking about scaling up deep learning neural nets, Hassabis said that his dream was to create a virtual self, that he hoped to do this in about 10 years' time. Then over at Harvard Medical School, we have David Sinclair, the molecular biologist, declaring that the first person who will live till 150 has already been born. That reversing the aging process in humans is hackable, and that we're living at a historical inflection point where we're going to use incredible advances in biotechnology to change what it means to be human, to enter this evolutionary threshold and evolve beyond what we are. And this stuff, I could stand here all day and rattle off examples for hours. This is just the tip of the iceberg. I had a venture capitalist say to me recently, about a month ago, I had no idea what a transhumanist was, but I've been reading your book and I definitely am one. And you hear that kind of thing a lot behind closed doors. Most people who think in a transhumanist sort of way don't walk around wearing the label. And because they're not organising all under one banner in one singular place, clinking their wheatgrass shots together and shouting all hail to the singularity, they can be hard to spot if you don't know what you're looking for. They're just doing the sort of things that make sense to them, given what they know about the world. And given how tech-saturated our world is now, the things that make the most sense to them just happen to be projects that are focused on using science, technology, and perhaps reason and policy making to unlock as much potential for our species as possible. And the key point there also is whether our descendants are human or not. And that brings us neatly back around to EA. Because in EA circles that I've encountered, there's certainly a non-trivial minority of people who self-identify as transhumanist. Intuitively, I think EAs are way above base rates here. But that doesn't begin to capture how prominent transhumanist thinking is in EA culture. So if we just take 3 of the most senior members of staff at the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford, all 3 have strong roots in the earliest transhumanist movements, and in Drexler's case, also proto-transhumanist movements in the 70s with the L5 Society, which was all about space colonisation. Now, I'm not making any claims on behalf of any of these thinkers about what labels they'd choose to wear or to what extent they consider themselves EAs. Only that FHI is an influential place in EA circles. A lot of EA-aligned people work there. And its work is something that EAs draw on and have been deeply influenced by. So this clustering of deep transhumanist roots would seem, I think, to matter in the culture. We've also got Martin Rees at Cambridge, who works for the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk and is also the UK's Astronomer Royal. And in his own words, organic intelligence has no long-term future. Then there's Toby Ord, who I think is someone who most of us would not rush to associate with anything overtly transhuman. And yet this is a passage from the introduction to the Precipice, where Ord, in a way that's stylistically different, but still very resonant with the Zuckerberg quote that we saw earlier, is talking about ending disease, poverty, and injustice forever. He's talking about creating heights of flourishing that are unimaginable today. And that hints at a kind of threshold moment, as indeed does the whole concept of the precipice, that our species is in a make or break time, that we're transitioning to something new. It's not merely unlocking the potential of humans to continue living according to the 2022 vision of reality that we're all in now. Because he's explicitly talking about reaching further out into the cosmos for trillions of years to explore billions of other worlds. The bit that we kind of lose there is it's obviously not the meat sacks that are coming with us to do that. And so to really ram home my point in my last rapid fire examples, we have Holden Karnofsky saying we're living in the most important century, and the reason is because it looks like we're going to have AGI. And because of that, we have the opportunity to shape what he terms a galaxy-wide civilization. And that's a claim that even Holden says is too wild to be taken too seriously. Yet he thinks there's lots of reasons that we really do live in a wild time and that we should be ready for anything. Amanda Askell at Anthropic, I want to live for 100,000 years. Ben Todd at 80K, there's a significant chance that AI catapults us into a new reality this century. Diana Fleischman explicitly identifies as a transhumanist evolutionary psychologist. And then we get posts on the EA forum like this one, with titles like, I want to be replaced. Because lots of things suck about being human, and to hell with anthropocentrism. If something better comes along, bring it on. So as I said at the start of this talk, transhumanism is everywhere. But perhaps nowhere more so than in EA culture itself, though we're not necessarily wearing the label. And perhaps that's wise. Because what of the yuck factor? What of the difficulty communicating about these subjects? Having written a book recently that talks very explicitly about transhumanism, I do have a greater appreciation for why some of the thinkers that have come before me have over time distanced themselves from that label and eschewed it. The name and the brand have some serious kookery attached to them to this day. And once a journalist hears the word transhumanism, all they seem to be able to see or want to talk about is this. Or sex robots. That's always a good one. And given these challenges, I'm coming around to the view that long-termism is actually a pretty good meme. Because there's lots in that framing of the future that captures the potential of the big picture without foregrounding the visceral yuck factor of, oh no, this makes me feel really small, makes the concerns of my life and my world potentially seem obsolete while I'm living them. There's something really rousing about the emphasis that we can be central to doing good on a massive scale and making the future great for a really long time. Talking about future people rather than M's or uploads or AIs allows a lot of folks to keep imagining an anthropocentric future-ish. And I found that there's no surer way to get many people to instantly shut down than to decenter humanity up front and bluntly leap from a human to a post-human future as the trajectory that we're on. This scans for most people as from organic to machine, from warm to cold. We instinctively associate machines with steel and wires, and we don't have good maps or stories that help us think about the vast array of experiences that post-human beings could have. So in order to not shut down at the very mention of such a future, I think many people do need to be led there gently, with lots of reinforcement through stories that show a sequence of change step by step. Something that eventually adds up to going somewhere that's different to now. If you leap straight to the conclusion, it's often instantly dismissed as implausible or repugnant. So this is a really roundabout way of saying, I'm sitting on some big questions about how best to talk about the future potential of our species going forward. My gut screams, be as clear and as honest as possible. Don't try and downplay the confronting stuff, because I do fear that we have a lot more to lose than to gain by investing too heavily in carefully curated memes and intellectual brands. Having new concepts is good, but not feeling too beholden to them and to their scripts or feeling afraid to go beyond them, I think that's really important also. And now more than ever, I think it's crucial to resist the urge to self-censor, because not only does that impact what we say publicly, it also starts to ring-fence and circumscribe how we actually think. So when it comes to transhumanism in EA, I don't think it has to be an either-or proposition. It's not we join the card-carrying ranks and identify as transhumanists, or we downplay it and distance ourselves from it as much as possible. Embracing some of the kookery of transhumanism and running around and talking about freezing your head in a vat of liquid nitrogen and living forever is probably not the smartest idea. But ignoring the rich intellectual tradition associated with transhumanist philosophy and literature, one that can help us think more clearly about where we've come from, what we are, and where we're heading as a species, also seems to me like a mistake. No matter what you want to call it, we're living in unusual and fast-moving times. We have never had more capacity to transform ourselves in radical ways, and we have never had more powerful means to derail civilization or to destroy ourselves. It is a precipice. It is a hinge of history. It is a make or break century, and it is a transhuman era. But in the end, I also think it's a Marty McFly moment. We've got the electric guitar, we know our Chuck Berry, but we're looking out at a sea of incredulous faces wanting and expecting Bing Crosby. Do it the way it's always been done, the right way, the proper way. I really think a lot of people just aren't ready to hear about grand futures, no matter how they're framed. And that is a really, really big challenge for those of us who research and communicate in those areas. So the challenge is picking away at those who are able to, I think as Oscar Wilde put it, think beyond the moment and see beyond the day. And try and convey a sense to as many people out there as possible that the future can be big, can be wildly different to what we might imagine, but that it's not going away just because we want to choose not to think about it. Thinking about it is key. And I'm going to keep thinking about how to get that message across in a better fashion going forward. And I can't wait to hear what all of you guys think about that. Thank you so much.